Good afternoon and salam. My name is Andrew Nowell. I'm a journalist at the Manchester World News website, and I'll be hosting and introducing this MACFEST 2022 event this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be asked by MACFEST to do this. So yes, welcome to the 2022 edition of MACFEST. This afternoon we're here at the John Rylands Library in Manchester City Centre, and we're hosting an exciting event taking you into the world of Islamic manuscripts and miniature paintings. We've had a look at the images this afternoon as we were setting the event up, and there is an absolute piece of amazing documents that are going to be shown this afternoon. Before I hand over, we've got a request. We'd like to follow MACFEST on social media, spread news about the festival using the hashtag #SpreadHoney.hate. That's been much appreciated, as most of the events are free and donations are very much welcome. Before we get to our event, the Book in Muslim Society, we're just going to hand over for a few minutes. I'm just going to welcome the chief guest for the event. Ivan Waiton is the Executive Director of Manchester UNESCO City of Literature. He's going to say a few words about that, Manchester's long relationship with the written word, and this stunning building in Manchester City Centre where we're taking place today. So yeah, over to you, Ivan.
Hello everybody. Thank you for the introduction, Andrew. As Andrew said, I'm Ivan Waiton from Manchester UNESCO City of Literature. Manchester was designated City of Literature in 2017. The bid was led by Manchester City Council, University of Manchester, Manchester Metropolitan University, Manchester Literature Festival, and a whole host of other partner organisations. UNESCO recognised many strengths in the city: its vibrant live literature scene, the city's passion for poetry, the world-class writing schools of the two universities, and the many specialist writing agencies, publishers and writers who make the city their home. And they also recognised that Manchester is a city of libraries. Manchester is home to the oldest public library in the English-speaking world. That's Chetham's Library, opened in 1653. And it's also home to Central Library, which in 2018 and 2019 was recognised as the busiest public library in the UK, recording over 2 years a year. And it's also home to this building, the John Rylands Research and Institute Library, a very, very special building. So a bit more about the building here. John Rylands Library was founded by Henrietta Rylands in memory of her husband John Rylands, who died in 1888. The building was designed in neo-Gothic style by Basil Shankly and opened in 1900 after 10 years of construction. Henrietta oversaw the design and the construction of the library and the purchase of all its initial collections. Indisputably, one of the great libraries of the world. John Rylands Library became part of the University of Manchester in 1972, and it now houses the majority of the special collections of the University of Manchester, making it the third largest academic library in the United Kingdom. When the library opened in 1900, it held approximately 70,000 books and about 100 manuscripts. Today, it holds more than 250,000 printed volumes and over 1 million manuscripts and archival items. Special collections span several hundred languages and span 5,000 years. They include Gutenberg Bible, the second largest collection of printing by William Caxton, the Rylands Library Papyrus P52 has a claim to be the oldest extant New Testament text, and also the Islamic manuscripts and paintings that we'll see this afternoon. The library holds personal papers and documents from some of the notable figures associated with Manchester, such as Elizabeth Gaskell and John Dalton. And John Rylands Library makes digital images of many of these items available to view online at the Manchester Digital Collections website. As I just mentioned, the library is also home to a research institute. It's been here since 2013. This is a dynamic community of world-leading researchers, curators, conservators, and imaging specialists based here in a world-class library, helping us understand human experience over 5,000 years. This June, Manchester City of Literature and its partners will deliver the second Festival of Libraries. You'll be able to meet high-profile speakers, artists and writers. You'll be able to come to events and activities for families. You'll be able to take part in book hunts across over 133 libraries throughout Greater Manchester, as well as here in John Rylands. So watch out for the programme announcement later in April about what to see this June at the Festival of Libraries. Follow Manchester City of Literature on social media for those details. However, John Rylands Library is free to visit all year round. It's currently open Wednesday to Saturday, and if you've never been before, I would encourage you to come to this special building at any time of the year, not just the Festival of Libraries. So welcome everyone on behalf of Manchester, UNESCO City of Literature, to this very special MACFEST event. I'll hand back to Andy. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Ivan. Before we get on to the main presentation for this afternoon on the book in Muslim Society, at the bottom, I noticed a few comments already in the chat window. If you'd like to make any comments about what you're seeing and hearing this afternoon, that's where to do that. Next to that, there's also a Q&A comment window. We'll be having questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions for our presenter today, that's where to leave them. So, time now for today's event, the book in Muslim Society, which is presented by Jake Benson. Jake has been cataloguing the Persian manuscripts held here at the John Rylands Research Institute and Library since 2020. He originally trained as a bookbinder, a conservator, and a paper marbler, graduated from Boston's North Venice Street School, and then worked as a book and paper conservator for many years. Inspired by Arabic, Persian, and Turkish technical accounts on manuscript production, he then pursued the study of those languages, primarily at the University of Maryland, College Park. Between 2012 and 2016, he worked as curator and senior conservator on a project assisting the National Library of Egypt in Cairo, cataloguing, exhibiting, and preserving their world-famous collection of Islamic manuscripts. He's got a doctorate on the early history of paper marbling, which took him to 12 different countries for research. He'll be defending that in August. This afternoon, though, he'll be taking a trip through the dazzling collection of manuscripts, the Islamic and Persian manuscripts, which are held here in the centre of Manchester, and it is a real treat for the first day of Ramadan. So Ramadan Mubarak to you all as well. And that is enough from me. It is time to hand over your presenter, Jake Benson. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you. I'm going to speak while I give this presentation, so you won't see me, but we'll see each other at the end. I'm going to speak today, and thank you first to the organizers of MACFEST, to Andrew and to Ivan, and also to my John Rylands Research Institute and library colleagues for assisting us today, and thanks to all of you for attending. I'm going to speak about the book in Muslim Society, and we'll start. Let's see if this works. It's not working. Hold on, there it goes. We'll first talk about different kinds of formats, that we not only have books as we know them today, but different types of structures and styles. So we have here in the Rylands Library many very ancient scrolls that come from Egypt, also written in Arabic. While many, of course, survive from ancient Egypt and hieroglyphs and Coptic languages, many also survive written in Arabic as well. And these would have been rolled up and then transported, delivered to people, and we're lucky to have many of these examples that survive from that time. However, scrolls continue to be used. We see them in many different ways, in edicts, documents, and such, but we also see them very small examples, such as this talisman, which somebody would have carried on their person in the small case. This is written in what we call micrographic calligraphy, meaning all of the writing on the page. We see larger examples of calligraphy with even smaller words written inside of those larger letters. Another format that we see, if we'll go, Gemma, it's going your, yeah, there it goes. We see also writing tablets, and this is something that survives from antiquity and persists in Islamic culture. And in these illustrations here, you can see these two men discussing while holding a writing tablets in their hands. We actually have examples of this that still survive today in different parts of the world, especially where children learn to recite Quran or learn to read and write using such tablets. It's quite convenient to be able to write and then erase and rewrite whatever it is. Aside from tablets, we also have what we call a codex book. That means a book like we know it today, where you can easily turn the pages. It's bound at the spine. And however, there are three main types of books that we find, especially within Islamic culture. The first are these box bindings. They are books, but they also have a kind of case made from the lower cover. Most of these do not survive intact. They are so old, they survive, they found them in archaeological digs, or they've been preserved in parts of mosques. But here you see a reconstruction of one. And here is one of the surviving covers that came from the Great Mosque of Qayrawaan. We have here in the Rylands manuscripts that have a similar format, which may have had that type of structure originally, but unfortunately they were subsequently rebound. But here you see a nice example of illumination from the early period. This is actually an early medieval style, this oblong format that came about especially during the Abbasid dynasty. So we see them much from the 8th, 9th century onwards. They also developed a new kind of script for writing Quran manuscripts. This is what they call the Abbasid New Style. Now, many of you may have heard of nearby Birmingham's Quran leaves that are written in an even earlier style. I can't get into a whole discussion of early Quran manuscripts today, but just to say that there is already, even in the first few centuries, a development, a noticeable difference in the scripts, as you see here. The second kind of book that you see is this kind of flapped codex. This is a book which looks like a book, except at the foredge, we have a flap that protrudes and then usually tucks in the inside of the cover. So we're actually going to stop now, and we're going to show you an example from the collection here at the Rylands, which is quite a bit later. We have this lovely Persian Safavid era manuscript of the story of Yusuf and Zuleika, or Joseph and Zuleika, which was authored by the late Timurid poet Abdurrahman Jami. This features a stamped cover and also a filigree doublure. They cut the leather very finely. They stamped the covers and with gold, and then, sorry. If you look closely, we can see some of the details in the blocking. They carved a metal block and impressed it in the cover, and this allowed them to make books very uniform. In fact, this book may have been part of a set of 5 books, because this was part of a quintet that Jami authored. And you can see that they also used a kind of flecking for the fly leaf, a flecked paper. This also emerges at about that time, where they start to use decorated papers, not just illumination. But this particular manuscript does have a beautifully illuminated headpiece. And you can see the area where the flap left an impression on the page. And you can see the type of calligraphy here. called Nastali calligraphy, another type that emerges in the 14th century, but proceeds to predominate in the Persian and Persianate world. These are Persian-speaking countries and others that emulate that style, especially the Ottoman Empire and in India, Central Asia. This manuscript also features a number of beautiful paintings and illuminated headers. This particular scene is of Joseph when he enters into the room with Zuleika, the wife of the Potiphar, who was the ruler of Egypt. And when he enters the room, when he enters the room, Zuleika has invited her friends to meet him, and she has set out dishes of fruit. And they proceed to cut the fruit. And when he enters the room, they are so astonished by his beauty that they proceed to cut themselves, and they feel no pain. So it's an interesting story from that particular tale, which is emblematic of love and how when you're in love, you don't feel anything else. So we'll now go back to the presentation. Well, we'll actually show very quickly, since we have this manuscript. Do you want to show the colophon? We're going to show the very end of a manuscript, just so that you see what this looks like. You can see here the inverted triangle. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit more. No, it's not letting me zoom. Sorry. Oh, it's just letting me zoom out. Yep, that's as far as in as it goes. But you see this inverted triangle on the left. This is where, at the end of the manuscript, the scribe explains that they finished the manuscript, and then signs it and dates it. And it dates, in this case, to 924, or about 1514 AD. Yes, and also another interesting feature, we'll return to this in a minute, but when we look at the edge of the manuscript, let's see if we can zoom out again a little bit. They've actually written the title of the manuscript on the edge. In this case, it says Yusuf Zuleika Musaver, meaning it's an illustrated copy of this manuscript. And this helped to enable the librarians to retrieve the books off the shelf. We'll come to that in a minute. So now we'll return back to the presentation. And now you understand what these flapped codices look like, and this shows you how they're constructed. But one of the things that we also see in these codices that's very integral is the use of paper. The earlier Mus'haf, the Quran manuscript, we don't use the term Quran to refer to an actual book, but we use the Quran, the phrase Quran, to mean the recited text. But Mus'haf means a book that is bound, in a sense analogous to Bible. Bible means a book, and then it came to mean the book in Christianity. So Mus'haf has come to mean this particular manuscript that is central to the Islamic faith. With the shift away from parchment, which is the skin of animals, which required a lot of labor and preparation, paper supplanted these modes and became very widespread in a very short space of time. However, it still requires a lot of labor. You can see at the top right, a water-driven mill, which is mashing the pulp. On the left, two men prepare and wash the pulp to refine it even further, while at the bottom, a man casts the sheet in a mold. In fact, what we see here today still survives in India, where you can see handmade paper-making specialists washing the pulp in the same way and casting sheets on the mold. We also have many examples of dyed, colored, and decorated paper, such as this illustration of a man dyeing a sheet in a vat. We have here in the Rylands a particularly impressive 14th century Quran manuscript, a Mus'haf, which is so large, it actually takes several people to arrange, hold, and manipulate it. Now, of course, this was not something that your average person could have at home. This was something designed by a ruler intentionally to place in their mosque. However, many people wanted to have manuscripts that they could actually hold more readily. We have also another example of a mushaf, which was broken up into several volumes. And this is one particular juz or section of a mushaf, which quite intriguingly has not only Arabic, but also, if you look very closely, small words underneath that are written in Persian and Eastern Turkic. It shows you, it illustrates how these languages came to be part of a mix in Islamic culture, that people used Arabic, they understood Arabic for religious purposes, but they also retained their own vernacular languages as well. At this time, we also see a shift in the scripts. Unlike the script I showed you earlier, the very angular style, they started to make various kinds of rounded scripts. And these came to have some specific usages and applications. There were three main calligraphers who articulated and standardized this style of script: Ibn Muqla, Ibn al-Bawab, and Yaqut al-Mustasimi. It's important to note that these three men, probably none of them were Arabs. They were actually, the first two were Persians, and the last one, Yaqut al-Mustasimi, was a converted slave. And Yaqut means a ruby. He was so successful at calligraphy that he was awarded this title of ruby, indicating his value. And Mustasim is his name that he took from his owner. It was the Caliph al-Mustasim in Baghdad. This development in scripts not only impacted Arabic language, but also fostered the development of literature in other languages as well. We hold here in the Rylands Persian MS-68, one of the earliest copies of the Persian translation of a text called Kalila Wadimna, or Kalila Vadimna. This actually is a translation from Middle Persian, Pahlavi Persian, which was used in Iran before the arrival of Islam, and that in turn a translation of the Sanskrit text called Panchatantra, or Five Tales. You can see the same kind of rounded script used here is something that we saw that emulates in these different styles. It also appears in Turkic language at the same time. It's also important to note that this particular text, this translation that occurred, the man who translated it really didn't just translate it. He created a new redaction. And unlike the Arabic text that he worked from, he interspersed it with verses from Quran, also traditions of the Prophet, and lines of poetry. And in doing so, he created a new style of literature that profoundly impacted Persian literature afterwards. Also, he worked in Ghazna in Afghanistan, where the poet who wrote this work, the Hadiqat al-Haqiqat, also worked at about the same time. Bahram Shah of Ghazna was a very powerful ruler, and Ghazna was a center of culture at that time. This particular manuscript is actually the earliest, what we call the full version of this text to survive. And interestingly enough, probably copied in Anatolia during the Ilkhanid period. These were the rulers who succeeded the Mongols, who converted to Islam, and they ruled over much of Iran and also Anatolia at that time. This also reflects an increasing establishment of libraries throughout the Muslim world. They not only kept books in mosques and in religious institutions, but also libraries. One famous library existed in Baghdad called the Dar al-Hikmah, where many translators worked, who translated works from Greek into Arabic, from Middle Persian into Arabic, even Sanskrit. And it's very interesting because, of course, many of these texts only survive in their Arabic translations. They don't survive in their originals. So we, until very recently, didn't know of any works of Archimedes, but we now only know of one which survives in what's called a palimpsest. This is parchment that somebody reused. But this particular illustration depicts the Dar al-Hikmah and how many books they had. And even more interestingly is this funny arrangement you see behind the librarian handing out the books. This actually depicts stacks of books on shelves. They depicted them here as blocks of color, but you could imagine that this is several volumes in each pile. And like Elizabeth showed earlier, we see many books that have the titles written on the edges of the pages very clearly to make it very easy for a librarian to retrieve them off the shelf. They also kept books, very special books, sometimes in a protective pouch or box or enclosure. For Quran manuscripts, especially sets of Quran manuscripts, they made elaborate boxes called a rabba in Arabic. This would be something that would keep all the volumes together in one, but then some other books would be kept in a very small pouch or case that made it easier to carry on the person. And in this particular example, has beautiful silver embroidery on the back, and also a ring on the side that could clearly attach to a strap so you could carry it. This scene, taken from the story of Layla and Majnun, one of the most popular romances that survives. It was versified by the poet Nizami, and according to the story, the two originally meet at school. And these school scenes often depict books, children reading books, writing with various implements around them. We can see, if we look closely, they're holding books in their hand in an oblong shape, and also these funny X-shaped structures throughout the room. And you see they're pointing to them, discussing what's on them. And what they are actually book stands. Now, many people call these Quran stands, but in fact, they were used generally for all kinds of books. We see a very simple one that was made in Somalia, a more ornately carved one made in Afghanistan, and of course, the rulers who endowed very large Quran manuscripts to mosques would have very elaborate, very beautifully decorated examples as well. But many people use them even in their home. Here we see children discussing a small oblong book. And we also have formats like this that survive. This particular type of manuscript many refer to as a safina or boat. But in fact, at the end of this particular manuscript, the calligrapher describes it as a beyaz. That literally means white. It often indicates a kind of personal notebook. But in this case, a little bit more than that, with this beautifully illuminated header and carefully arranged columns of poetry. Also in that same school scene, we see a boy polishing the sheet of paper. We have to remember, they not only had to make the sheets of paper, but they had to prepare the sheets so the pen could glide across the surface and facilitate writing. We see an example of a writing board like this. It's called a mastara in Arabic. It literally means a ruler. But this particular example is a board which has threads stitched through, arranged in lines, and you would place a sheet of paper over top of it, rub it with a polished stone or piece of glass, and it would impress the lines into the sheet. And when you wrote on the sheet with those lines, you could feel the line with the tip of the pen. This is how they arranged the page. We also see another context, not only mosques, not only libraries, not only schools, but also booksellers and stationers would make books that people could purchase. If you could afford it, you could ask a copyist to copy a book out for you and decorate it as you wish, or even add illustrations. Or you could purchase a blank book and then go to a library and copy the book out yourself. We have many examples that survived. In fact, this particular illustration comes from Shiraz in Iran, just like the illustrated scene we saw earlier. And in his Jawahir al-Akhbar, or Jewel of Reports, which was completed by Pir Budaq Qazvini in circa 1576, he traveled there and he observed that there are in Shiraz many writers of Nastaliq calligraphy, all copying one another, making it impossible to distinguish between their work. The women of Shiraz are scribes and if illiterate, they copy as if they were drawing. This author visited Shiraz and ascertained for himself that in every house in this city, the wife is a copyist, the husband a painter, the daughter an illuminator, and the son a bookbinder. Thus, any kind of book can be produced within one family. Should anyone desire to procure 1,000 illuminated books, they could be produced in Shiraz within a year. They all follow the same pattern, so there is nothing to distinguish them by. And this really illustrates the extent of the trade in books. We not only have elite books made for rulers, but we have a range of different kinds of books that many people who could, of course, read and write could afford to acquire for themselves. And this trade existed in virtually every single urban center throughout the Muslim world. We also have a third type of book that lacks a flap. Many think that a book with a flap is a quintessential style Islamic book, but in fact, many survive that lack flaps. And we start to see this in the 15th and 16th century. This particular example in the Rylands has, like we saw earlier, a stamped exterior cover and a very beautifully cut leather filigree interior. However, this would be very expensive. It uses gold and silver, a lot of labor to produce. We also have lacquer that appears at that time. Artists figured out that by varnishing paper, they could paint on it like it was a canvas. We do have very elaborate examples like this with floral scenes, but we also have other examples that use just decorated paper. As we saw earlier, the artists figured out that instead of spending so much time and effort, energy, and materials, which often cost more than the labor, they could quickly decorate a sheet of paper by sprinkling gold or silver, or even just colors. This particular manuscript from the collection is made by spraying the sheet over a stencil. It's very hard to see, and it looks like it's been fully painted, but in fact, it's been made in a kind of mass manufactured way. You can see on the right and left, they've used the same exact stencil. They sprayed it once, then they flipped it over, and then they sprayed the other side, this white with a white color on this indigo blue paper. Then they painted the interior scene. So rather than illuminate all of the page, they could quickly make them, and then the artists could just afterwards outline them with gold to give the effect as though it had been illuminated, but it actually saved a lot of time. They even would make illustrated scenes like this. Again, they took the same stencil, they sprayed it twice, and then the painter went back, and just like a coloring book, they could alter how they colored the pages, but they didn't have to plan and lay out the page themselves. They simply could infill the shapes as they desired. This, again, it saved a lot of time, and it made the books more affordable, but also gave a kind of visual delivery of more expensive illustrated volumes. Another type of paper that appears at that time are marble papers. Abri, it's called in Persian, meaning clouded or cloudy. In Turkey today, many refer to it as ebru, and also in Iran, abrubad, meaning cloud and wind. And in Central Asia, the phrase abre bahar, or cloud of spring, predominates. Here you see an example of a flyleaf where many Mughal administrators spanning several generations impressed their seals and made notations during annual inventories during the reigns of different rulers. It really is quite interesting because it shows how the book was once held in the library of Jahangir, then it goes to his son, Prince Khurram, who then became the Emperor Shah Jahan, who built the Taj Mahal. Shah Jahan then gives it to his son, Darashikoh, his intended heir and successor. When Shah Jahan declines, his sons Darashikoh and Aurangzeb have a struggle for the throne, and in the end, actually, Aurangzeb wins that struggle. They seize the book from Darashikoh's possessions, and Aurangzeb then becomes the Emperor Alamgir, and he presents this manuscript to his sister, Roshan Ara, who took his side in the struggle for succession. So it tells a kind of almost soap opera of the Mughal family in these seals and notations. We also see marbled papers in a much more intricate style that appeared in about the 1590s to 1600, using combs and very carefully arranged designs to cover the books. In this particular case, just a sheet of paper and a very minimal amount of leather, often called jilde magzi, meaning hemmed binding in Persian. They also use the term chahar köşe, meaning four corner. It's another Persian term in Turkish. What's interesting here is that you can actually line up the boards and see how the bookbinder cut down the one sheet of paper to cover these two boards, but in fact, obviously cut it down from a much larger sheet that they could use to cover several different boards. I'm going to then talk a little bit about the impact that all of this literature had. This manuscript also comes from Shiraz. What's interesting is that it is by a poet, Hasan Sejdiye Dehlavi. Dehlavi means he's from Delhi. He's from India. He was a very influential poet from the medieval period who lived before the time of Hafez, who many may know is one of the greatest Persian poets. Hafez took great inspiration from Hasan Dehlavi. And what's interesting here is that a particular family who lived and worked in Shiraz, not for a court, but for this stationary bookselling trade, created this manuscript. And they did so about 100 years after the death of Hafez, who was from Shiraz. This manuscript, as you see in the notes on the right, proceeded to go through several different owners. Not only in Iran, it travels to the Ottoman Empire. And at the top, you see its script we call Devanagari. This is an Indic script. So it went from the Ottoman Empire to India. And then from India, it comes to Britain. Eventually, a very famous professor, educator of Persian, Hindustani, Urdu languages, Duncan Forbes, acquired this manuscript. And that part of his collection is here in the Rylands today. Another kind of manuscript, very important to the hearts of devout Muslims, are devotional texts, such as this Anam al-Sharif. Anam is a surah in the Quran that many people would include with a selection of different surahs and often many different prayers. They often include depictions of the holy cities in the Hijaz of Mecca and Medina. You have to remember that many people could not necessarily afford to make the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage was very expensive and also full of risks. Many people, unfortunately, died during the pilgrimage. So for many people who could afford to have these kinds of books, this took you on an imaginary kind of a visual journey where by reading those texts, reading about the pilgrimage, reading about the rituals that you performed, in a way they were able to do this in their minds and experience what it was like to go on pilgrimage, even if they could not personally do so. So they show this kind of transformative, transportative influence that books could have. We also see an impact of Islamic manuscripts outside of Islamic culture. Many in Europe took inspiration from the kinds of decoration and applied them, especially in the Renaissance, where you see many kinds of arabesque motifs emerge, not only in this case on a book binding, but also in typography and other forms of decoration. And also, as people took an increasing interest in the Islamic world, they started to learn the languages. And this is a very interesting case. We just discovered yesterday that the Rylands holds this particular album that a man who was a Swiss man, a mercenary who worked for the East India Company, had a calligrapher make this album on behalf of his friend, Sir William Jones. Sir William Jones was a very influential figure. He studied many languages, and he was one of the first people to translate Persian poetry into English for the first time. Those translations had a profound impact on subsequent English writers. Many in what we call the Romantic era emulated this style. And here we have a case of a man, his name is Charles Fox, who you probably haven't heard of. He trained as a dentist in Bristol and then worked as a bookseller. Somehow, I'm not sure how, he learned Persian, and he himself tried to translate poems into English. And here at the Rylands, we also hold many of the volumes that he had. That Romantic era poetry profoundly impacted later writers, especially Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron. Another aspect of Islamic manuscripts that also impacted Europe is the art of paper marbling. We see marbling used in many book bindings, and it even became something of a tradition here in Britain. But few people know that actually the Bank of England applied partially marbled papers as a kind of security device to some of the earliest paper money in circulation. Now, the bills that circulated in 1695 no longer survive, but the Bank of England still holds this unused seal bill with just a strip of marbling down the middle. And this next document shows just how they used it. You would cut through that design in an irregular manner. And because of the intricacy of the pattern and the irregular cut, by matching the two halves together, it proved the validity of the contract. This particular document comes from Benjamin Franklin. He used this method to secure French funding to support the American War of Independence. So we can say that this particular technology that came from the Islamic world not only secured the fledgling economies in Britain and the United States at critical junctures, but even helped to safeguard my country's independence. So on that note, we'll end the presentation and we will switch back to look at one more manuscript. We're going to look at an album, and the first thing to say about this album is a few short comments about this lovely cloth, because it appears like it could be Ottoman Turkish silk, but it also could be of European manufacture. Again, another impact that people admired these kinds of brocades so much that they imitated them in factories around the world. When we open up this album, we first see an example of poetry. This is a ghazal, or a lyric poem of Hafiz, actually an excerpt of a lyric poem. And we frequently see poems like this in albums. In this case, somebody has signed it underneath. We don't have the signature of the actual calligrapher, but somebody attributes it to a very famous Mughal scribe. In fact, it's probably not true, but you do see at least how the calligraphy, they mounted it on different kinds of paper and also gilt the ground of the calligraphy surrounding it. So you see it forms kind of cloud bands. And on the next page, we see two kinds of paintings. And let's zoom in a little bit here so we can take a closer look. On the right, we see this very unusual composition. It's of a fairy who is riding a horse. And if we look even more closely, you will see that the horse is made up of different figures, all jumbled together. We call this composite drawing. And it's a special style of painting that emerged actually in Persian culture. Some of the earliest examples survive from Safavid period, but also in India. And here, even the dog, who is the companion of this fairy, is also filled with other figures. On the opposite side, unfortunately, it's sideways, but when you view it on the internet, you should be able to look at it more closely. This is a satirical painting, which comes from Kishangar in India. And it's quite interesting because it shows these mercenaries and men who are having a rather ribald time, and also shows at the top musicians move that out again, musicians who are entertaining a wealthy lady and her attendant here at the top, while we have the scene of the mercenaries below. Such albums not only featured poetry and paintings, but also examples like this. It's actually a Quran verse, which, if you zoom in very closely, is again another example of micrographic writing. They wrote the main phrase and then infilled it with various surahs or chapters of the Quran. And here's somebody, a former owner, his name was Adam Clark, a Methodist minister, actually, who spent some time here in Manchester, and we hold many of his papers. He tried to identify the various surahs. It's very hard to read because the writing is so small. And actually, if you go and visit this on the internet, if any of you can possibly help us to identify these surahs, it would be a great assistance to us because it's very tough to read. And in fact, I can tell you that Adam Clark misidentified this particular verse. The name of this style, somebody's asking in the chat, it's called ghubar in Arabic, which means dust. Ghubar is a term also used for the spray painting of gold. It's not just used for calligraphy, but in this particular example, ghubar calligraphy is often referred to this kind of micrography, also used in what they called pigeon post, when you wrote a note and you rolled it up on a very small piece of paper and attached it to a carrier pigeon to then send the message to another town. They used a ghubar for those messages. On the next page, we have, let's see if we can move here, zoom out a little bit, and then we'll move over. We have another example of a composite drawing with what appears to be a Mughal prince riding an elephant, which is composed of 9 women. In fact, the caption, quite intriguingly, says that the rider is Krishna, the Hindu god. But in fact, we do have examples of this same scene with Krishna riding the elephant. But in this case, we see that a painter took inspiration from that type of composition and instead rendered it as a more Mughal type style. Then finally, we have on the last page, last but not least, if I can get this to go out. No, this really doesn't like to do this. There we go. No, hold on, let's just zoom out. We have actually many albums preserve detached pages of manuscripts, and they would preserve these pieces probably because they either liked the passage or they liked the handwriting. In fact, it's written on a silver flecked paper. And at the very bottom, if we zoom in, it bears the seal, and the seal looks like the seal of a Muslim ruler, but in fact, it's not. It's an Englishman. His name was Sir Elijah Impey, and the seal says, Chief Justice Sir Elijah Impey, written in Arabo-Persian characters. And it's dated with the year that he became the justice, one of the first chief justices in the Bengal presidency. So with that, we end this presentation. And I'm sure many of you may have some questions.
You want to have a look at the questions as well?
Okay.
So,
when did European bookmakers start using colors? Okay, well, that's really not the topic today, but we can say that they started using colors when they started making books. We have many examples of medieval manuscripts here in the Rylands, and you can view some of those on the website. But I can speak more specifically about the Islamic world. I'm not so much a specialist in European manuscripts, but if you have questions about Islamic manuscripts, I would be happy to try and answer them.
We've also got underneath there, Jake, for Ghubar writing, did they use invisible ink? Can you answer?
Rubar, did they use invisible ink? Well, I don't know, and it would be very hard to find examples that survive. We definitely have recipes for various kinds of invisible ink mentioned in technical treatises, lemon juice, other kinds of milk, other things that people used. But to what extent people really use them, we don't know. We really need more archaeological evidence to be able to prove that.
I think Akbar Ahmed raised his hand, so I don't know if you can get him to put his question into the window, and we might be able to bring it up.
Somebody has asked, what is the art style with the forms inside a bigger form called? We call that composite painting or composite drawing. Since it's made up of composite parts, where the large figure, often an animal, appears infilled with different figures, people, other animals, all jumbled together. Will the BBC make a documentary based on your excellent presentation? Well, that's quite, thank you, that's very nice. I'm not sure if they would, but we will have more presentations about the wonderful collections here at the Rylands in the future.
Watch this space, maybe.
Yes, exactly. And also pay attention to our Manchester Digital Collection site. We have a handout. Did we have the link for the handout? That on there, you can find links to all of the different collections and many of the images that I shared with you today. I shared not only images of Rylands manuscripts, but also others from other collections. And you can see many of the things in more detail. You can explore all of the images of the manuscripts from cover to cover.
I'm going to let you read that.
Okay.
Question from Sonia.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and sharing the treasures of the Rylands Library. I wonder if you could speak about European collectors' practice of collecting and collating more than one Persian and Arabic manuscript and rebinding them together, especially towards the end of the 18th century. Concomitantly, how does one decipher if collection is deliberate or was intended as a majmua? Majmua means a miscellany. And actually, I think we should be careful about conflating a miscellany, which is a text where somebody has taken different passages of different works and put them together in one book, from a composite manuscript where people have taken completely different texts and put them together. Now, this is certainly something that we see not just in the Islamic world, but also many Europeans who visited the Islamic world would collect texts. Because many of them existed in small pamphlet form, they would then bind them together. As far as what their intentions were, it's really hard to say. Many times these texts appear extremely different. I've personally seen some that jump from, we have one that has various tracts, prose treatises, and then there's a recipe for cooking lentils. So it really jumps all over the place, and it really depends on what struck the person's fancy, what they decided they felt was worth preserving. And in many cases, they may reflect very personal kinds of collecting habits, not necessarily intellectual exchanges, but a recipe for lentils is, oh, I might like to make that. So it's not to say that there was some sort of scientific exchange or something on that level. Could I step into the center of the frame?
There's a question there in the main chat about Persian calligraphy being holy in India, because we can see Persian calligraphy in historical and holy places.
Okay, well, Holi is a festival of color in India. And actually, Persian calligraphy being called Holi, I'm not sure of that. I've not personally encountered that before. I mean, yes, Holi is a Hindu holiday. We do have examples of even the Mughal emperors celebrating Holi. They had a great time because you run around and throw color on each other, and many people took delight in that. But as far as there being some sort of relationship between Persian calligraphy and Holi, I'm not aware of that.
have a few
Maybe
more.
I can ask a question, Jake.
Sure.
Hi. Akbar Ahmed said, put in a good word for a documentary. I think it's a brilliant idea. We can try, of course, inshallah, in the future. But my question is from a layperson, really. I just want to get a feel of what it was like. I mean, who actually benefited from these manuscripts? Probably the rich people. Secondly, how much would an average book cost? And then there's the process.
Yeah.
You know, there's a binder there, there's the painter, the whole thing. Give me a feel of how long it took, how much money it might cost the person, and where do these books land in? Do ordinary people have access to them in the past?
That's a great question. I think the main thing is that with the establishment of libraries throughout the Islamic world, they really help to foster education. And while we definitely see very lavish examples of books that were made for rulers and for elites, economically elite, the wealthy people, we also have many books that are not so elaborate. They're written on plain paper. They are simply bound. We have one, I debated whether to show it today, which is bound in plain paper. It's not even dyed paper. But these examples of books that are much simpler also could reflect what I said, where it was much cheaper to buy a blank book that was very simply made and go to a library and write the book out for yourself. And I see many examples of this. Sometimes in the colophon, the end of the book, the end of the manuscript, the person writes and says, I've completed this book at this library, and they've obviously written it for themselves because they've written many notes in the margins, and they definitely interacted with the literature. So we can see that there are definitely different stratas. And also what I said about the stationery trade, that the stationers could make a book as expensive as you wanted, but they could also make them quite humbly and inexpensive if that's all that you could afford. And if you could only afford, a blank book that you could then fill in yourself, it made it easier for the person to write. So it eliminated some of the labor, but you still had to go write the whole book, which isn't exactly a little bit of time. It takes a while to copy out a whole book.
Perhaps if I could just ask a question following up there, Jake, on that. How widespread would literacy of that kind have been in the Islamic world at this time? I was just thinking compared to literacy levels perhaps in Christendom in Europe at the time, where it was probably quite restricted to church and government and official people being trained for official roles.
It's hard to say exactly. We have some accounts that say in Baghdad that, for example, there were 10,000 ink pots that were emptied at the end of a day when such a famous lecturer lectured at the Great Mosque. But I feel that 10,000 ink pots is a bit of an exaggeration. So we can't always trust historical sources to be honest. And we have to have a little bit of caution when we read those sources. And I see also in relation to this that someone has asked about education. And so, I mean, we can see that there's definitely periods where, of course, when there are declines in a particular society, that the education declines, and then also revivals. We see in Afghanistan that during the reign of Bahram Shah, there was a great efflorescence, and then there's a decline, and then there's a resurgence again under the Timurids, and then there's a decline again, and then there's a resurgence again with the establishment of the Durrani dynasty. We know that Ahmad Shah Durrani had many scholars and intellectuals who attended his court, and that also then fostered developments throughout society. Also, this kind of bookmaking that occurred in the early modern period using just decorated papers, simpler book structures, a very little bit of leather made it much more affordable. And in general, in the early modern period, we see an increase in education and literacy. Now, the other person has asked about schools, and if we could go back to that question.
Yes, I think I remember this question. It was, did the fact that texts which were copied out by students in madrasas, does that influence what manuscripts have survived and what texts we have, I think, is the idea of Theodore's question here.
Yes, and then we do see certain kinds of texts which clearly young people used. And we can see notes and kind of scribbled notes by young people. We have a number of texts. For example, one particular set that was called Panjganj, which means 5 treasures in Persian. This particular set of 5 texts proved very popular in Central Asia and Afghanistan for teaching in schools. And we have one example that will appear soon in Manchester Digital Collection. It actually contains 2 of the texts. One is called a Pandname, or a book of advice. It contains many different kinds of statements about morals, and then together with another popular text called the Mahmudname. So the one book is written in the center, and the second book is written in the margins. And it's written in a very kind of hasty, not necessarily refined style. It has a few pictures, but it is the sort of thing that even school children could have had access to. And in fact, with the advancements of printing, that particular book becomes something that we see in India and Central Asia quite frequently.
Excellent. We got any other?
There is a question there by, how does the library contribute to the development of Christian theology?
I'm sorry, but I can't quite answer that. I mean, there are definitely reactions and responses in Christian theology to events and ideas in the Islamic world, but that's not really my field. There are others who you can find, I'm sure, who discuss this in detail, but that's not my particular field.
Andrew, have you seen any other questions?
I haven't.
Okay, if not, I have my own as a backup. So Jake, this is for people who are not familiar with John Rylands' library and they want to get a feel of what is in store for them. For example, how many manuscripts are there? I know there are lots. Which part of the Muslim world they belong to, and how did they end up in your library? From various sources, I know they come from various sources, but just to give a feel of, how did John Ryland get them? Where did they come from?
In fact, if you look at some of the records, in the handout that we've sent, we mentioned that you can view many records for the manuscripts in Fihrist, which is the United Kingdom's union catalog for Islamic manuscripts. And this is a really great resource because it shows not only our manuscript here in the Rylands, but also in relation to other repositories, the Bodleian, the British Library, Cambridge, and elsewhere. And so you can view our manuscript here, you can view information about that in relation to another manuscript. However, in the manuscripts that I have cataloged, I have made a special effort to document the provenance insofar as possible. And we have many names that come up. I mentioned a couple of them here: Charles Fox, Adam Clark, a Methodist minister, William Jones, we have manuscripts of his. So there are many people like that, but we also have many former owners. I showed the page that is literally covered with Mughal seals, and I'm still trying to figure out and analyze exactly who all those people were. But we have many examples of different owners. The other example of the manuscript of Hassan Dehlavi shows it takes a journey around half the world before it comes to Britain. So documenting the story of the journey that these manuscripts took actually can often prove very time-consuming, but also very interesting, because it really shows how people responded, read, and reacted to those manuscripts, and much less the story of how they came here to Britain.
Okay, following on from that, Jake, I gather there's the largest collection of the Holy Quran in your library. If you want to say something about that.
Well, we do hold a number here. I actually am not aware of the exact quantity, but we have quite a range. I know that we don't seem to have the earliest form of Quran manuscript, which at the University of Birmingham, they identified. We have a fragment of one, but not necessarily a whole folio, a detached folio, or a quire, meaning a set of leaves of a Quran manuscript from that period. We do have several Abbasid period. These are still medieval, quite old. We may have other, maybe perhaps some papyri fragments that have some prophetic traditions. That's actually a very important corpus that many of the earliest traditions survive, not necessarily in the compilations that were made in the later Abbasid period, but actually these early papyri, and that awaits further study. But we have many different kinds of Quran manuscripts that span many different regions. I know that we recently identified one that was completed in Southeast Asia, but it's been classified as Arabic because of it having Arabic letters. So in fact, it was only with another specialist of Southeast Asian manuscripts that she identified this as coming from Southeast Asia. So I myself, I'm more comfortable with the sort of Arabic world, Ottoman and Persian world into India, but I'm not as knowledgeable in Southeast Asian manuscripts. So I rely on the help of other people who have that specialty.
Andrew, any other question? Would you like to ask a question, Andrew?
I think I've already nipped in with a couple of them.
Okay, I mean, if you like, Jacob, I mean, what can I say? Time to wrap up then.
Yes.
It's an amazing, amazing feast. When I talked to you a few months back, you were full of different ideas and your knowledge was incredible, and I knew you would deliver a feast, just like Elizabeth Gow did for the last 2 years. And what a day to have it on first day of Ramadan. Thank you so much. And it's an honor for you, Jake, because we've got people joining us from at least 3 or 4 people from America from one end. And they've just got up early in the morning and they switched on to your event. And then we've got somebody all the way from Jakarta. So it's been brilliant, as well as our own national local. So you have delivered an amazing feat. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to host John Ryland. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us as well, for hosting this event, as particularly in this sort of format where it's a live event and it's a digital event. Quite a challenge, but well done, brilliantly. And of course, Ivan is there, our chief guest, who started this off. Thank you, guys, for amazing work for this event. And then, of course, your team, Gemma at the back, and of course, Elizabeth Gow, with whom we started all of this hosting of miniature painting from John Ryland. So well done. Thank you so much. I want to thank you, of course, all the attendees who have joined us from around the world. Thank you once again. Salam to all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And Ramadan Mubarak.
Ramadan Kareem.
All our Muslim friends from wherever you are. So Steve, if you can place the slide for next event. So next event, everybody, you will join us is for the Festival of Ramadan. And we started that off beautifully with this amazing art feast. So we are taking you all the way to Algeria, an event hosted next Sunday at 2 p.m. British time, where you have a feast of art, culture, heritage, how they celebrate Ramadan in Algeria, but also what kind of food do they eat? What sort of cuisine? You'll see some of all of that there. So please join us for next week. Thank you so much for giving us your precious time at the weekend on Saturday. And if you're fasting, Mubarak and good luck. Inshallah, it will be amazing. And Ramadan Kareem and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Goodbye.